My name is Juliana Rossi Boone. Everyone has always called me Jules. I am 32 years old now, and last Easter morning I stood on the front steps of a small country church outside Knoxville, Tennessee, watching my father-in-law, a Baptist pastor of 30 years, hold my daughter's hand, while a Catholic priest gave the closing blessing over both our families at once. Harold Boone once told his own congregation, from the pulpit without using my name, that he worried some marriages let salvation get replaced by ceremony. Everyone in that sanctuary knew exactly who he meant. 3 years later, he stood beside me at that same church door and asked if he could hold my daughter's little wooden rosary during the blessing, just to feel the weight of it in his hand. It took a 5-year-old girl saying one unscripted sentence at a Sunday dinner table to get us there, and I am going to tell you exactly what she said, because I have never told this story publicly until tonight. If you have ever loved someone whose father looked at your faith like a danger to his son's soul, this one is for you. If you have ever sat quietly through a sermon aimed at you from 6 feet away, stay with me. Welcome back to Bridges of Grace, where we tell the long, slow stories that never make it onto anyone's testimony night. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, and subscribe so you do not miss how a preacher who once called my faith empty ceremony ended up asking to hold my grandmother's rosary in his own 2 hands. I grew up in East Knoxville in a narrow brick house 3 blocks from St. Anthony's, where my grandmother Concetta kept a statue of the Blessed Mother on the kitchen windowsill and taught me to say a decade of the rosary before bed, the way other families said goodnight. My father, Sal, ran a small landscaping business and never missed a Sunday Mass in his life, not even the year his knee needed surgery and he had to be wheeled up the ramp by my brother. Faith in my house was woven into the calendar itself. Ash on the forehead in early spring, purple cloth over the crucifix during Lent, a whole table of foods blessed on Holy Saturday that my grandmother had been assembling since before my mother was born. Nobody in my family ever asked whether I had made a decision for Christ on a particular date. They asked whether I had gone to confession before Easter, whether I had kept the Friday fast, whether I remembered my grandfather's soul on the day of his passing every single year without fail. I did not think of my faith as an event. I thought of it as a season that never ended, which turned out to matter enormously later on. My mother, Anna, kept a small holy water font by our front door that every guest touched on the way in and out without ever being asked, a habit so automatic in our house that I did not realize until college it was unusual to anyone. She was not a demonstrative woman about her faith either, but I never once saw her skip a Sunday, not for weather, not for a head cold, not for anything short of the hospital itself. The same steady, wordless devotion I would later recognize, oddly, in a Baptist preacher who prayed nothing like her at all. I met Wyatt Boone the fall I turned 26, at a community fun run downtown that raised money for the Children's Hospital. He was pacing a slower runner near the back of the pack, matching her stride, cheering her through the last stretch, though he clearly could have finished 20 minutes earlier on his own. I asked him at the water table afterward why he had not just run his own race, and he told me, a little embarrassed, that his daddy always said the whole point of a race was making sure nobody crossed the line alone if you could help it. I remember thinking that was one of the kindest things a stranger had ever said to me in under a minute. We talked for an hour in the parking lot with our medals still around our necks, and somewhere in that hour I told him about my grandmother's rosary, the one she had given me at my confirmation, and how I still carried it in my bag most days even though I did not always remember to use it properly. He asked what it was for, genuinely curious, and I told him it was for staying close to something bigger than my own worries, one bead at a time. He said his own grandmother used to say almost the same thing from her porch in Sevier County, staying close to the Lord one verse at a time, though she meant it with her Bible held open on her knee rather than beads moving through her fingers. I did not know it yet, standing in that parking lot with a stranger's kindness still warm in my chest, that I would think of that exact comparison again, years later, in a country church parking lot far larger than this one. We dated for nearly 2 years the unhurried way, Sunday dinners at his family's place outside town, Mass with my family most weeks when his shift schedule allowed. Wyatt came to St. Anthony's with me 4 times before we were engaged, standing a little stiffly through the incense and the kneeling, and afterward told me it felt like stepping into the middle of a very old conversation that had clearly been going on a long time before he arrived. He meant it as a compliment. His father would later hear the very same description as a warning sign. I went to Cedar Fork Baptist Church with Wyatt half a dozen times, sat through altar calls with my hands folded in my lap, and found something in the plain hymns and the open Bibles on every knee that felt less foreign than I expected, closer to my own grandmother's whispered prayers over the rosary than either family would have guessed possible. When Wyatt proposed at the finish line of that same fun run a year later, down on one knee with both our families watching from the sidelines, I said yes before the announcer even noticed what was happening. I gave him my grandmother's small wooden rosary that same evening and told him to keep it in the glove box of his truck, close enough to reach without thinking about it. He did. For years, he actually did. The rehearsal dinner was held in the fellowship hall at Cedar Fork. Folding tables and paper plates and a banner someone's aunt had made that said "Congratulations, Wyatt and Jules" in careful cursive. Harold Boone stood at the head table in his good gray suit and gave a toast that started warm, talking about raising Wyatt in the faith and praying for years he would marry a woman with a genuine, personal relationship with the Lord. And then he looked past me toward my father and said he only hoped that the sacraments a person leaned on would never become a substitute for the actual saving grace they were meant to point toward. The room went quiet in that particular Southern way, where nobody gasps but everybody suddenly finds their sweet tea very interesting. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at all. Wyatt's mother, Fay, laughed too brightly and tried to move the room along with a story about the honeymoon itinerary, and the moment passed the way moments do at a rehearsal dinner, quickly covered over though never actually erased. I sat through the rest of that dinner with my rosary bracelet warm against my wrist and understood, plainly, that my father-in-law had just told an entire fellowship hall that my faith, and my father's faith, and my grandmother's faith might not be real faith at all. I did not understand yet that this was the exact accusation I would hear him retract, sentence by sentence, in his own church office 3 years later. We married that spring in a service that tried to honor both families as best it could. Vows exchanged at St. Anthony's with Father Alessi presiding, followed by a reception where Pastor Boone was asked to offer the dinner blessing, which he did graciously, publicly, and without a single edge in it, the first sign I had that his warmth toward me was real, even when his theology made him nervous. I did not learn the real shape of Harold's fear until years later, from Fay, sitting on her back porch one afternoon while Wyatt was inside with Lucia. She told me that Harold had grown up the son of a hard, distant father who left the family for a season when Harold was a boy, chasing after a different woman and a different church clear across the state line, only to come home 2 years later claiming a conversion experience that Harold, even as a grown man, had never fully trusted. Harold had watched his own mother nearly lose everything to a man who used the language of faith carelessly, swapping churches the way some men swap trucks, and he had decided, somewhere in that watching, that a person's religion was only as trustworthy as the seriousness with which they had personally chosen it, on their own, deliberately, with nothing inherited about it at all. Fay said he had never told either of us that story himself, not because he was hiding it, but because he had never quite found words for it that did not sound like an excuse. I understood something differently after that afternoon. His fear was never really about the rosary or the incense. It was about a boy who had once watched his own father treat faith like a costume, and had built his whole ministry around making sure nobody in his family would ever be able to say the same thing about him. Knowing that did not excuse the years of quiet judgment, but it did, slowly, help me stop taking every one of his comments as personally as I once had, since most of them, I came to see, were really conversations he was still having with his own long-absent father, and I had simply been standing close enough to catch the overflow. The first year of our marriage settled into a pattern I did not fully understand until much later. Harold never repeated anything as blunt as the rehearsal dinner toast, but he managed things quietly from a distance, the way some men run a household from behind a newspaper. When we hosted our first Thanksgiving as a married couple, he called Wyatt rather than me to ask whether the blessing would be said properly this year, by which he meant the Cedar Fork way, rather than the sign of the cross I had grown up making before every meal. He began sending Wyatt sermon recordings about salvation by grace alone, forwarded with no note attached, as though the silence itself carried the argument he was too careful to make out loud. He stopped asking what happened at Mass and started only asking, gently, what exactly the Catholic Church taught about earning your way into heaven, a question dressed up as curiosity that was really something closer to an indictment. He referred to St. Anthony's as your church in a tone he never once used for Cedar Fork, which was simply the church, no possessive required, as though mine needed the qualifier to justify existing at all. In our second year, he asked one of his deacons, a kind older man named Ellis Whitcomb, to have a quiet word with Wyatt about the dangers of a spiritually divided home. Ellis, to his enormous credit, sat with Wyatt on the tailgate of his truck one evening and told him plainly that he had watched Jules serve alongside the church food pantry every single week for a year without missing once, and that whatever else was true, that kind of faithfulness did not come from an empty religion. He told Harold the following Sunday that he would not be delivering that particular message, and Harold did not speak to him from the deacon's bench for the better part of a month. If any of this feels familiar, if you have ever had someone quietly enlist a third party to manage you rather than simply talking to you directly, I want you to know it says far more about their fear than it ever says about you. I promise the second half of this story is coming, and it changes everything you think you know about how it ends. Stay with me, and hit that subscribe button, because you are going to want to see how this turns. When my grandmother Conchetta passed in our second winter, Harold sent a sympathy card in careful handwriting and did not attend the funeral mass, telling Wyatt privately that he would not know how to sit through a service with that much incense and Latin without feeling like he was compromising something. That was, I later understood, the truest sentence he had said to either of us in years, though not at all in the way he intended it. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that never make a good story told alone, but add up the way water adds up against stone. He left me off the family prayer chain email list for the better part of a year. An oversight, he said, corrected only after Faye noticed and quietly added me back herself without telling him. When Wyatt's younger sister married the following year, Harold handled the rehearsal dinner seating himself and placed me at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, a placement he blamed on space constraints when Wyatt asked about it, though there had been 2 empty chairs closer to the head table the whole evening. A man from his church stopped me in the parking lot after that same wedding and asked, kindly, whether I had ever really been saved, or whether I simply grew up going to Mass the way some folks grow up going to the same barber shop their whole lives. I told him I had been baptized as an infant and had renewed that promise with my whole life ever since, and he nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something he already suspected. Harold's warmth toward me in those years was real, and that was the confusing part. He hugged me at every visit, asked after my work at the elementary school where I taught second grade, remembered my birthday without fail, but it was a warmth that stopped precisely at the edge of anything touching faith, a line so consistent I could have marked it on a calendar. He would ask about my classroom, my garden, my parents, and never once in 3 years did he ask what Lent meant to me, or why I kept a small icon corner on our bookshelf, or what the rosary in my hand actually said when I prayed it. It was a very particular kind of exclusion, one that let me fully into his home and kept me carefully outside the one room in his heart he had decided was not safe to open. There was a campaign for the grandchildren, too, quiet and never quite spoken aloud as a campaign. Before we had children at all, Harold gave Wyatt a children's Bible to keep on hand for some day. Purchased, Faye told me later, the same month we got engaged, as though preparing ground for a harvest he intended to plant himself regardless of what either of us actually chose. The low point came at a summer potluck, our second year, with both families crowded around long tables under a pavilion at the church camp Cedar Fork used every August. Cicadas going hard in the trees, paper plates sagging under fried okra and banana pudding, a whole afternoon of ordinary southern warmth that made the moment that followed sting even sharper by contrast. I was newly pregnant, still keeping it quiet, still tired in that particular early way that makes a person want to sit in the shade and say very little. Harold was telling a story to a group of deacons about mission work when he turned, almost as an aside, plate in hand, and said he sometimes worried Wyatt had married a lovely girl whose religion had never actually required her to be born again, and that he meant it with real love. He truly did, but somebody eventually had to say these things out loud before it became a habit nobody corrected. Nobody at that table laughed. Nobody corrected him either. Wyatt's hand found mine under the table, but his mouth stayed shut a beat too long, and I excused myself to the ladies' room and cried against a paper towel dispenser, quietly, so nobody outside would hear over the noise of the pavilion fans. That night, I called my mother from our back porch and told her I did not know how many more years I had left in me of being loved warmly everywhere, except the one place that actually mattered to me. My mother, who had said very little through all of it up to that point, told me something I wrote in the back of my missal that same night and have kept ever since. She said, "Juliana, you are not required to win his argument. You are only required to keep praying the way you already pray, and let the years do what only years can do." My best friend from college, a woman named Renata who had married into her own share of quiet religious suspicion, listened to the whole potluck story over the phone 2 nights later and did not tell me to simply forgive and forget the way I half expected. She told me instead that some men spend their whole lives measuring other people's faith against the one shape they were taught to recognize, and that the only real cure for that particular blindness was time, lived out loud, patiently, right in front of the eyes that refused to see it. "Write it down," she said, "not to use against him, just so you remember, years from now, that you were not imagining any of it. If you have ever needed a friend to say exactly that to you, someone who could hold your hurt without asking you to shrink it for everyone else's comfort, tell me about her in the comments. And if nobody has said it to you yet, let this be that voice tonight." Subscribe to Bridges of Grace, because there is more of this story still ahead, and it does not end where you might expect. So I did exactly what my mother told me to do. I kept doing what I had always done, not to prove anything to anyone, simply because it was who I already was and had always been. I said my rosary every evening the way my grandmother had taught me. I kept my Friday fasts quietly, without announcement, and never once corrected Harold's theology across a dinner table, though there were plenty of nights I wanted to badly. There were nights during that middle stretch when I doubted whether patience was actually working at all, whether I was simply absorbing years of quiet judgment for no reward beyond my own tired pride. I remember one particular evening, folding Lucia's tiny laundry alone, while Wyatt worked a late shift, when I sat down on the nursery floor and cried harder than I had at the potluck, not because anything new had happened, but because nothing had, because the sameness of it felt like its own kind of verdict. I called Father Alessi's rectory that night more out of desperation than faith, and he reminded me, patiently, that endurance rarely feels like progress while a person is living inside it, that it only ever looks like progress from the far side, looking back, which is a hard thing to hear when you are standing in the middle of it with wet laundry in your lap and no evidence yet that anything at all was changing. I went to confession that same fall and told Father Alessi the whole ugly shape of what I was carrying, the potluck comment, the years of being examined by a man who had decided about me before he ever really knew me. He did not tell me to confront Harold, and he did not tell me to simply absorb it either. He told me that the saints were not remembered for winning arguments. They were remembered for outlasting seasons that tried to convince them their faith did not matter, and that the same patient endurance that had carried the church through centuries of misunderstanding could carry one daughter-in-law through one difficult father-in-law, if I let it work on its own timeline instead of mine. I did not feel comforted exactly, walking out of that quiet confessional, but I felt steadied, which turned out to be closer to what I actually needed. Our daughter Lucia was born the following spring, named for my grandmother's own mother, and Harold showed up at the hospital with a casserole and a small white Bible with her name embossed in gold on the cover, and I placed it on the shelf beside her icon corner in the nursery, without a single word about either one belonging more than the other. Her baptism, 6 weeks later, was held at St. Anthony's the way our tradition requires, and Harold came, stiff in his good suit, standing near the back of the sanctuary, while Father Alessi poured water over her small head, and the whole congregation welcomed her by name. He had asked, weeks earlier, whether there might be some role for him at the service, and I had to explain, as gently as I knew how, that godparents carried those particular roles in our tradition, and that a grandfather's part came later, at the family table, not at the font. He accepted it politely and said very little in the car afterward, and it was months before I understood the quiet had not been agreement so much as one more stone added to a pile he was already quietly carrying. There was a particular afternoon that same spring, before Lucia was born, when Harold asked, over coffee, whether any children we had might attend Cedar Forks Vacation Bible School every summer, rather than the parish's own religious education classes. Phrasing it so gently, it took me a moment to understand what he was actually proposing. I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that any children we had would grow up learning their own family's faith fully, at their own parish, and that childhood was not a contest between two churches trying to get there first. He did not raise it again directly, though I noticed for a season afterward that the children's Bible he had bought migrated from the guest room shelf to somewhere I never saw again. Those years held their own small recurring rituals, the kind that only reveal their shape in hindsight. Every Thanksgiving we alternated tables, and every Thanksgiving at the Boones, Harold would ask Wyatt to say grace and then add his own postscript once the amen had landed, praying out loud that the whole family would someday come to a single true understanding of the gospel, a phrase he used so often it stopped registering as a barb after the second year, though it never once stopped being one. Every Christmas Eve he declined our invitation to midnight mass, gently, always with a reason that sounded reasonable on its own, and added up, year over year, to a pattern nobody in the room would name directly. Every Ash Wednesday I went to Mass alone before school. A smudge of ash on my forehead I never bothered to wipe away before running my second-grade classroom, and Harold, seeing it once at a family dinner that same evening, asked, not unkindly but not gently either, whether I thought God really needed to see a mark on a person's skin to know their heart. I told him I did not think God needed the mark at all, but that I did, some years, needing a physical reminder of my own smallness, in a world too easy to move through, without ever really looking at myself honestly. He did not have an answer for that one, and it was, I think now, one of the earliest cracks in a wall he had built so long ago he had stopped noticing it was there. There was a dinner that same second year, small enough that nobody outside our family would ever hear of it, where Lucia, not yet 2, folded her hands the way I had taught her, and thanked God for Mommy and Daddy and Grandma Fay in the same easy breath, and Harold, without quite meaning to, corrected her gently at the table, telling her she should call him Grandpa too, since that was what good children called their elders in a proper Christian home. Wyatt's jaw tightened, but he let it pass for the sake of the meal, and I said nothing at all, and drove home that night wondering how many small corrections like that a person could survive before she started to wonder whether her whole way of raising her own child was quietly being marked down as a lesser version of someone else's. Wyatt held the middle honestly during those years, though not always well. There was one hard stretch, our second winter, where he asked me after a particularly sharp comment from his father to just let it go for the sake of keeping peace at the holidays, and I told him that letting it go for one holiday had somehow quietly become letting it go for 2 years running, and he sat with that a long time, jaw working, before he finally understood what I meant. After that conversation, he stopped asking me to be smaller so the room could stay comfortable, and started instead standing beside me at the table. Not against his father exactly, but firmly, visibly, on the side of the woman he had actually married. There was a harder season buried in the middle of those years too, one that had nothing to do with churches at all. Harold's small congregation went through a difficult building fund shortfall the year Lucia turned 3, and rather than ask anyone for help, he simply started skipping his own salary some months to keep the lights on. Faye told me, quietly, over coffee one afternoon, and without a word to Wyatt or Harold, I started leaving grocery gift cards in their mailbox, anonymously for a season, never once mentioning the years of cold Sundays behind us, never once expecting a thank you for any of it. Harold never brought it up afterward, though Faye told me much later that he had guessed exactly who was behind it within a month, and had simply chosen, for reasons of his own pride, never to say so out loud. There was also a good deal of ordinary sweetness braided through those same years, which I want to be honest about, because a story told only in its hard moments tells a lie by omission. Harold taught Wyatt to fish on the same lake his own father had once taken him to, and some Saturdays he took Lucia along too, teaching her to bait a hook with a patience he rarely showed anywhere else in his life. He never once withheld affection from her, not for a single day of her whole childhood, and that steady, uncomplicated love was, I think, the one place his fear never fully reached, and the first crack of light I let myself notice, though for years I did not quite trust it to mean anything larger. 3 years had passed since that rehearsal dinner toast by the time everything finally shifted. 3 years measured out in Thanksgivings and Christmas Eves and small dinner table corrections. 3 years of a marriage that had, by every outward measure, gone on being ordinary and mostly happy, despite the current running quietly underneath it. I do not mention 3 years to wound anyone with the number. I mention it because time was the only thing that ever actually did the work in our family. Not arguments, not confrontations, just years, stacked patiently on top of each other, until something finally had room to move. The disagreement earlier that afternoon had been about a young couple in Harold's own congregation. A boy raised at Cedar Fork who had fallen in love with a Methodist girl from 2 towns over, and Harold had said something in the truck on the drive home about hoping the young man had more sense than his own son had shown, a sentence Wyatt had not let go of easily. By the time we all sat down to eat, the air in that kitchen was thick enough to cut with the butter knife sitting untouched beside the cornbread. It happened on an ordinary Sunday dinner in early autumn, our 3rd year, at Harold and Faye's kitchen table, both families crowded around the usual spread of fried chicken and green beans. Wyatt and Harold had gotten into a low, tense disagreement earlier that afternoon about a decision at the church, voices raised just enough in the next room that everyone at the table had heard the edge in them, and dinner had started in an uncomfortable silence nobody quite knew how to break. Lucia, 5 years old by then, sat between her 2 grandfathers with her small hands folded, waiting for someone to say grace the way she always did, and when nobody moved fast enough to suit her, she bowed her own head without being asked, and said it herself, in the plain, unrehearsed voice of a child repeating something she had absorbed from 2 different tables her whole short life. She thanked God for the chicken and the green beans, and then, completely unprompted, added that she hoped God would help Grandpa Harold and Daddy stop being mad at each other, because being mad made everybody's tummy feel funny, and Jesus said to love each other even when it was hard. Her teacher at Sunday school had told her so, and she said amen and looked up expecting somebody to pass the biscuits. It was such a small thing, the way she said it, no drama in her voice at all, no sense that she had said anything remarkable, just a 5-year-old stating a fact the way she might announce that the sky was blue. She was not performing forgiveness for an audience. She had simply noticed the tension in the room and applied, without any coaching from either side of her family, the one plain truth both her grandfathers claimed to believe above all others, that love was supposed to hold even when it was hard, and she had said it in words closer to Cedar Fork's plain gospel than to anything I had ever taught her at St. Anthony's, though I recognized my own faith in it too, the same faith my grandmother had folded into a decade of the rosary every night of her life. Here is a small thing worth checking before we go any further into this story. If there is someone in your life who has been slow to soften, someone you have kept loving through a season where they doubted whether your faith was real at all, do not wait for a 5-year-old to say the thing you have been too tired to say yourself. I will tell you exactly what happened at that table in a moment. But first, I want you thinking about your own version of it. Subscribe if this story is speaking to something you have been carrying quietly. Nobody at that table said a word for a long moment. Wyatt's face went red and soft at the same time. Faye pressed a napkin to her mouth, and Harold, a preacher who had delivered thousands of sermons in his life, sat perfectly still with his fork halfway to his plate, staring at his granddaughter as though she had just handed him something he had spent 30 years failing to notice was missing from his own preaching. He did not say anything else that evening beyond passing the biscuits himself, quietly, and asking Lucia what else her Sunday school teacher had told her, in a voice gentler than I had heard him use with me in 3 years of marriage. Faye caught my eye across the table for just a moment, and I watched her decide, visibly, not to say a single word about it either, letting whatever was happening in her husband's face happen without an audience to make him self-conscious about it. The days that followed gave him the kind of quiet a man does not often choose for himself. Faye told me later that he barely spoke through most of that week, that he sat out on the porch some evenings with his own Bible open on his knee, without turning a single page, and that he asked her once, out of nowhere, whether she remembered what he had actually said at our rehearsal dinner all those years ago, word for word, because he found he could no longer remember it exactly, and it was bothering him considerably. Nobody pushed him to explain himself. Whatever he was building toward, he built it alone, the way real change usually gets built, long before anyone else is allowed to see the frame going up. The apology came 11 days later, in his own small church office, of all places, surrounded by decades of sermon notes stacked in cardboard boxes along one wall, a framed photograph of Wyatt's high school graduation crooked on the shelf behind him, a coffee mug gone cold beside a Bible so worn the cover had softened like cloth. He asked me to come by after school on a Thursday, said it was nothing urgent, and when I arrived he was sitting behind his desk looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his hands folded the exact same way his granddaughters had been at that dinner table, the afternoon light coming low and gold through the one window behind him. He told me he had been turning something over ever since that Sunday and needed to say it plainly before he lost the nerve for it. He said that for 3 years he had told himself and told other people, deacons, his own congregation from the pulpit without ever using my name, that my faith was ceremony without substance, that the sacraments I leaned on might be standing in for something realer, that I had never actually chosen for myself. He said he had believed every word of it sincerely, which somehow made the whole thing worse rather than better. Then he said that a 5-year-old girl, his own granddaughter, had prayed a more honest prayer over fried chicken than he had managed to preach in longer than he cared to admit, and that he had spent an entire week trying to figure out where a child raised in a supposedly divided home had learned that kind of plain, unguarded love, and had finally been forced to admit the answer was staring at him across every dinner table he had ever sat at with me. He said, "I was wrong, Jules. I preached grace for 30 years and forgot to actually extend it to my own family, and I am asking you, plainly, to forgive me." His voice caught on the last word in a way I had never once heard from a man who spoke in front of 200 people every Sunday without a tremor. I did not deliver a lecture, and I did not remind him of the rehearsal dinner, or the potluck, or any of it at all. I simply reached across his desk and took his hand and told him that I forgave him completely, and that I had never once actually stopped loving him, even on the hardest of those nights, because that was the only kind of love either of our churches had ever truly taught me to give another person. The months after that apology were not instantly easy, but they were honest, which was entirely new between us. Harold asked me, hesitantly at first, what the rosary actually said when I prayed it, and I sat with him at his own kitchen table one evening and walked him through it bead by bead, and he listened the way a man listens when he has finally decided a thing is worth understanding, rather than correcting. He defended me too, in a room where I was not present to hear it, which my mother always said was the truest kind of apology, since it costs a person something they never get thanked for directly. Faye told Wyatt, months afterward, that Harold had stood up during a deacon's meeting discussing a young couple in a similar mixed marriage, and told the room, plainly, that he had spent years wrong about his own daughter-in-law, that he had let fear dress itself up as doctrine, and that he would not sit quietly while anyone else in that room made the same mistake he had made. She said the room went as still as ours had at the rehearsal dinner, only this time the silence belonged to something being repaired instead of something breaking. There was a smaller moment, too, one nobody but Faye ever witnessed, that told me the apology had actually taken root, rather than simply been spoken once for my benefit. A woman at Cedar Fork's Fall Festival asked Harold, within her hearing, whether it bothered him that his granddaughter was being raised Catholic, and Harold answered, without a pause long enough to suggest he had rehearsed it, that his granddaughter was being raised entirely in the Lord, and that he had spent years confusing unfamiliar with unfaithful, and did not intend to keep making that particular mistake. Faye told Wyatt about it that same night, and Wyatt told me, and I sat with that second-hand sentence for days, turning it over like a stone worn smooth. Wyatt changed too, in the space that apology opened up. He began asking me questions he had never quite dared to ask before, about the saints, about the rosary, about why we knelt so much during Mass. Not to convert, never that, but because his father's honesty had finally given him permission to be curious about his wife's whole life, instead of only the parts that were easiest to explain at his father's table. In return, Harold started teaching me his mother's cornbread recipe, the one he had never once written down for anyone outside his own family, standing at my elbow correcting the amount of buttermilk, telling me a story about his own mother's kitchen I had never heard in 3 years of marriage. We started a small new tradition that first Christmas after, sharing dessert at both tables instead of choosing only one, his mother's chess pie set out beside my grandmother's cannoli, neither one apologizing for the other's existence anymore. That first Lent after the apology, Harold surprised all of us by asking what I typically ate during the fast, not to comment on it, but because he wanted to understand what his granddaughter would someday be taught to keep. He showed up to a Friday family dinner with a pot of vegetable soup he had researched and cooked himself, slightly oversalted and utterly unnecessary and completely unforgettable, and I had to excuse myself to the powder room for entirely different reasons than the ones I used to have in that same house. That same summer, he showed up unannounced one Saturday morning at St. Anthony's food pantry, where I had volunteered quietly for years without him ever once asking about it, and stood in line with the other helpers, waiting to be given a job, and spent 4 hours sorting canned goods alongside me and a dozen parishioners he had never met, introducing himself simply as Jules's father-in-law, no mention of Cedar Fork at all, as though for one Saturday the only thing that mattered was which family he belonged to, not which building he prayed in. One Sunday that spring, Harold stood up in front of his own congregation and told them, plainly, without softening it, that he had spent years afraid of a faith he had never actually taken the real time to understand, and that he had been wrong, and that his own granddaughter had shown him more honest grace than most sermons he had preached in 30 years of ministry. He never once suggested I leave the Catholic Church, and I never once suggested he leave Cedar Fork. Some things were never actually going to be the argument. He still, to this day, insists on adding his own loud amen after every family grace, even at my parents' table, even after Father Alessi has already given the blessing, and everyone has simply learned to let him, because some things about a person are his to keep exactly as they are, and that particular stubbornness stopped feeling like a wall a long time ago, and started, instead, to feel like family. My mother, for her part, took a while to soften toward Harold, given that he had never wounded her directly, only her daughter, but watching me carry 3 years of quiet grief left its own mark on her, and it was Lucia, in the end, who thawed the last of it, running between her 2 grandfathers at a birthday party, with such uncomplicated joy that my mother finally leaned over to me at the dessert table and said, in Italian, low enough that only I could hear it, that a man who loved a child that fiercely could not have a rotten heart underneath all that fear, only a frightened one, and that frightened hearts, given enough time and enough evidence, generally found their way back to something truer. It has been 2 years now since that afternoon in his office, and last Easter, both families gathered at St. Anthony's for the Vigil Mass, Harold sitting near the back in his good suit exactly as he always had, watching the candles pass hand to hand down each pew until the whole dark sanctuary glowed. Only this time he stayed for the entire service, instead of slipping out early the way he used to. Afterward, out on the church steps in the morning light with the bells still settling overhead, He asked Lucia if he could hold her little wooden rosary during the closing blessing outside, just to feel the weight of it in his own two hands, while Father Alessi prayed over both our families at once, and Lucia handed it over without a second thought, the way children hand things over when they have never once been taught that faith is something to be guarded rather than shared. He still hums the invitation hymn from Cedar Fork sometimes, out on his porch swing with Lucia on his lap in the evenings, only now he is not humming it at me across a room like a quiet challenge. Last Christmas, at her own request, I taught him the words to a simple Marian hymn my grandmother used to sing while she cooked, and he taught Lucia the words to his own favorite hymn in return, and on Christmas Eve the two of them sang both, back to back, off-key and completely unbothered by it, while Wyatt clapped along and my mother wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. Lucia asked me last week, out of nowhere, the way children do, whether Grandpa Harold loved God the same way I did, and I told her yes, exactly the same amount, just wearing different clothes for it, the way two people can love the same God in two entirely different languages and still mean precisely the same thing by it. She seemed satisfied with that answer in a way most of the adults in her life took 3 long years to arrive at. Wyatt keeps his grandmother's Bible on the truck seat beside my rosary now, both of them riding together in the glove box the way the rosary alone used to, and neither of us has ever once needed the other's tradition to make room for it by shrinking. Nobody ever converted. Nobody ever needed to. The peace we finally found was never a doctrine. It was simply a father and a daughter-in-law who had spent years afraid of losing the same young man's soul, finally learning they had been fighting for the exact same thing all along, only calling it by different names. Renata asked me recently, half joking, whether I had ever imagined my father-in-law standing in a Catholic church parking lot asking to hold a child's rosary, and I told her the honest truth, that I had spent years imagining almost every other ending except that one. Mostly the kind where he simply softened enough to stop mentioning it, never the kind where he actually wanted to understand. Faith, it turns out, is rarely defeated by an argument strong enough to win it. It is only ever worn down, slowly and gently, by evidence a frightened heart cannot keep explaining away. I think about that rehearsal dinner often now, not with the sting it used to carry, but almost with tenderness, the way you look back on a younger version of someone you love, and forgive them the things they did not yet know how to say gently. Harold was not wrong to be afraid that spring evening, standing at that head table in his good gray suit. He was only wrong about where the danger actually was. It was never in the rosary, and it was never in the incense, and it was never in a Latin phrase murmured 2 pews behind him. It was only ever in the years he almost let fear cost him a daughter-in-law, and a granddaughter, and every ordinary Thanksgiving that came after. If you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. Love does not win an argument. It simply keeps showing up, faithfully, year after ordinary year, until the fear finally runs out of reasons to stay standing in the doorway, sometimes helped along by a 5-year-old with fried chicken on her fork, who was never once trying to prove anything at all. I would love to know in the comments whether anyone in your husband's or your wife's family ever needed years to come around, and whether someone eventually told you plainly that they were wrong, and what that felt like the day they finally did. If this story reminded you of your own long road with someone who once looked at your faith like a threat, share it with them tonight, and subscribe to Bridges of Grace so you do not miss the next one.